Dr. Carol Spigner is a professor emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. She has been the Associate Commissioner of the Children's Bureau at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She was responsible for the administration of federal child welfare programs. Dr. Spigner has served on the Pew Commission for Children in Foster Care, the Mayor's Child Welfare Review Panel for the City of Philadelphia, and the Workgroup for the Michigan Racial Equity Task Force. She also serves on the board of the Center for the Study of Social Policy. Dr. Spigner has published a variety of articles in the area of cultural competency, permanency planning, and relative care, and her work focuses on the reform of public child welfare agencies and child welfare policy. 10-6 is pleased to welcome Dr. Spigner.
Thank you.
Is there anything that you'd like to add to your introduction? You've accomplished a lot. And I'm sure some of these are still ongoing. Anything else that you'd like to add to this?
No, I think probably the one additional thing I would add is that I started this work as a frontline worker. So all of my work in policy is really informed by what I understand from working with families directly and trying to make sure that the system responses to those families were equitable.
Great. And so you're, in terms of social policy, when you said work within the framework of social policy, can you kind of expand on that a bit as it relates to child welfare or, any social policy that has to do with social welfare?
Sure. I mean, I was responsible for the implementation of the Family Preservation and Support Act, the Chafee Independent Living program when I was at the federal government. So my work in policy has been policy analysis, has been policy advocacy, and policy implementation. And it's almost exclusively around child welfare. I was finishing my graduate work when the whole permanency planning framework was put in place. And so much of the policy work I have done has been about expanding the scope and the implementation of that framework.
Very interesting. So when you said permanency, for someone who probably looking at where permanency and planning in related to child welfare, what is so distinctively different from what they had, the type of say policy or practices that they had in place prior?
Well, there was no, I mean, prior to 1980, there was no language in public policy around permanency. In fact, permanency, the whole concept of permanency really came from retail child welfare practice when people began to recognize that large numbers of kids were coming into care, but they weren't going anywhere. They were stuck in the child welfare system. So we were not good at returning kids to their parents. We were not good at making decisions if kids could not return to their parents. We weren't very good at finding alternative family arrangements for them. So in 1980, the permanency planning framework gets introduced into child welfare policy as part of the Social Security provisions. And so we at least get the articulation that children deserve a permanent home. Prior to that, there had been research that talked about children as in foster care as orphans of the living, talked about children in foster care as youngsters with no place to go.
Very interesting. So would you say, based on the that new policy then, would you say the permanency, I wonder if I'm saying it correctly, is it permanency and planning or permanency planning?
Well, it's actually both of those things.
Mhm.
First of all, there's this notion that kids are entitled to a family. They're entitled to be cared for and nurtured in a permanent family arrangement, whether that's their own parents, whether early on it was primarily thought of adoption. Now we think of it as including kinship care, just the whole range of things. So permanency as an idea, as a concept and construct was really new to policy in the 1980s. I really am old. It's been a long time. But then the question becomes, how do you in practice, when you're working with children and families and communities, how do you get from a youngster being in care to having a stable permanent arrangement? And that involves permanency planning, so that the permanency is the goal and planning is the way you get there. And so there was this notion that children's statuses need to be reviewed regularly, that their case plans need to have goals that included some kind of permanent arrangement, and that the public agency was responsible for making sure that happened by using some systematic steps.
How effective since the implementation has that policy been? Would you say in terms of
It's mixed. It's mixed. There's been, I think, tremendous evolution in the policy over the last 40 years, but it's mixed. And you can see that we're not succeeding at permanency planning when you see that we have 20 to 30,000 kids aging out of foster care every year.
Yeah.
These are kids who the child welfare system has not been able to care for. At the same time, when we began permanency planning, the adoption system was really a system for babies. And we began to develop the capacity to place older children, to place children of color, to place children with handicapping conditions. Did we achieve that for 100% of the kids? No. But the number of kids that are able to exit the system to permanency is significantly greater than it was before the policy was in place.
Okay, so at least we can, if one is to assess the, as you said, the evolution of that, they'll be able to, the statistics, the data is there to kind of show some type of improvement.
Yeah, I think the data shows the progression. You know, we still have children who are in limbo. We still have children who are orphans of the living, and we see that with our kids aging out. But that was so much more likely 40 years ago than it is today.
Very good. So you mentioned policy advocacy as part of some of the multiple things that you do. Other than, you mentioned the permanency and planning that you've been heavily involved in, what other policy advocacy have you done and probably has been implemented or in the works?
Sure. I think the thing that I'm proudest of is the thing that I worked on the longest. When I was a doctoral student, I came into doctoral studies as someone who was a child welfare practitioner. And what I could not understand was particularly for children of color who have very complex familial networks that include relatives and non-relatives. I really could not understand why our options were either return home and adoption, and there was no place in the middle where relatives might be, that kind of thing. I actually did my doctoral dissertation on the evolution of legal guardianship. It was a
Okay.
historic study because I was concerned that we needed more than two strategies, that we needed to be able to secure permanence with relatives, with non-relatives who were part of a child's kinship network, and in some instances with foster parents who made a long-term commitment to the children without being willing to adopt. And so I really started my work as a doctoral student, fooling around with this concept of legal guardianship and trying to figure out how it could apply to child welfare and how it could apply to kinship care, you know, because at that point in time, I was seeing a lot of grandparents who were taking in their grandchildren on a permanent basis, but they didn't want to be the people who were the agents in terminating parental rights against their own children. It put them in a catch-22.
Yeah.
So I was really intrigued by this and by its application. And so I did that work as a doctoral student. I continued as kinship care became more and more prevalent. I continued to be engaged in that. And then I can't cite the year, but during the time I was at the Children's Bureau, we were able to insert language into the legislative policy that allowed states to use legal guardianship as a way of stabilizing children's lives and realigning the relationships between children and their caretakers.
And these legal guardianship, can you describe what it looks like in terms of, is it length of time, the age of the children, does it matter, or is it taken into consideration? And is it that someone, like, as you said, a grandparent or you know, someone who is in the child's life may advocate for that? Or is it on the other hand where the social worker would be advocating, you know, within that kinship network or within any relational, you know, patterns there to find someone to take on this guardianship? How does that work?
Well, I mean, it varies from state to state because the way our system is designed, states really are the architects and the implementers of policy based on what's possible. And so in terms of policy, it allowed for federal financial reimbursement for children who are in guardianship arrangements, just like you can get an adoption subsidy for children who are placed in adoption and have special needs. So a lot of the design of it is with the states, but basically, as you are seeking permanency for a child, if I talk about it generically, as you're seeking permanency for a child, you have to rule out return home. You have to assess the relationships that children might be in, and more children are going to relative caretakers. And then as you engage in permanency planning, it's not just returning kids home or terminating their parental rights and having them adopted. Relatives can be considered if they're willing to undergo a study, if they're willing to make a long-term commitment. What's different about guardianship is that it only transfers some of the responsibility of care for the child to the caretakers. It doesn't require a termination of parental rights. And so the discussion of guardianship can come from the child welfare worker. It can come from the court-appointed special advocate. And it can come from the family itself. But it's one of the factors that needs to be considered. And I think the most important thing is that you want to be sure it's not being used to interrupt a return to the family of origin. And you want to be sure that the relationships are going to be stable and protected.
Very, very good. And so you've done a lot. You talk about from as early as or way back in the 80s, even
Yes.
now in your retirement status, you're still doing work for the state of New Jersey. So that's your passion, clearly. And so can you explain how does all this work that you've done or that you're doing inspire sense of meaning to others? And you can, sometimes or inspiration, probably we're so busy we don't take time to reflect on, what is it that we're doing and how it's reflecting on others. But I'm sure you can, do that reflection now. And, how does your work inspire others?
Well, I have always, I guess, perceived myself, no matter what roles I've been in, as kind of a teacher and mentor. So I'm really fortunate that I have many former students in a variety of incredible roles. And I feel like I've made a little contribution to their view of the world and their view of the work. So for me, that's very instructive. In fact, it's an interesting time in my life because I've been watching this whole reckoning around social justice, around racial justice, around Black Lives Matter. And I am so inspired by the two generations that succeed me in terms of the way they've picked up the mantle, the way they are able to analyze and articulate the challenges that are before us. And so sometimes I sit around and say, God, if I could write so-and-so a note, what would I say? Because I am so pleased to see them pick up the mantle with such talent and brilliance and professionalism. And so for me right now, at this point in my career, much of the meaning comes from not only the work I do, but seeing younger people, they're not necessarily young, younger people doing this work. I spend a lot of time in New Jersey these days, not literally, but working with the state of New Jersey. And we've been working on racial equity issues. And to see the talent that's embodied in the steering committee, not only are they talented people, but they're committed people. And so they're in an environment that's given them permission to move forward. And just to see the talent and see people who may not have understood all the complexity of this, but to begin to grapple with it and begin to move it gives great meaning to my work over time.
Yes, I must agree that I observe some of the boldness, as you said, in people who are, using the social justice approach or you looking through social justice lenses. There's this fierceness that we've seen, and it's also technologically driven, and it just creates this passion. So yes, I'm sure the inspiration is there, and they're watching you as well, and just adding on to all of that. So let's look at some of the multiple programs then that have been implemented over the years. I mean, there's so many. You said you've taught social policy and practice, and that's the department that you've been involved in for years at Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania. Those programs that have been implemented to improve the status of minority people or poor people, children and families. Um, do you feel as if there's a high priority around these programs? And are they, do you think these programs or policies then that are outcome of you know, whatever it is that lawmakers are trying to do, have created safety net for children and family, that probably kind of segue into child welfare policies and helping children and families succeed. What do you think about these multitude of programs over the years?
What I've seen over the course of my career is an erosion of the social safety net. It was built in the 1930s as at the wake of the Great Depression. There is something in the American ideology that prevents us, and I mean us as a collective,
Mm-hmm.
from really valuing poor folks, really trusting poor folks with resources to make their lives better. We are very stingy in terms of social benefits. And I think, I mean, part of the whole context right now is such distrust for the poor, such distrust for people who are different.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a legacy of American thinking that, you know, has been with us. We imported some of it from Britain, but Britain managed to evolve and we didn't. And so I think our social safety net is tattered. I think that, I mean, even the debate we're having now about the relief program for the coronavirus, so the whole strategy for coronavirus, their income support questions in terms of children's allowance, their income support questions in terms of unemployment insurance, their support to local government questions, in terms of their ability to protect their residents. And if we really listen to the debate is people are in trouble, they're hurting, we need to respond. Oh, we can't spend that much money. But underneath we can't spend that much money is that we don't trust those people with that money. So our safety net is very frayed. It's driven a lot by crises, big crises like the pandemic, like recessions, that kind of thing. And we've not really taken a human rights perspective on the social safety net. What are people entitled to in order to grow and thrive? There are, from my perspective, two huge contributors to children coming into the child welfare system.
Mm-hmm.
One is poverty, and the second is lack of adequate housing. And so the child welfare system becomes a way of responding to the weaknesses in our existing social safety net.
Mm-hmm. And so those two, I would say investments then, in terms of housing that is needed, and some type of financial support then, I guess, in order to create that safety net around them, so that in terms of these vulnerabilities that may crop up. But if you're saying that there's a lack of trust in the relationship, is the do you think there's some merit to that based on what you've seen happen, how materialism, the media has influenced us, where some of us, our focus are not as strong in terms of, you know, creating this foundation for family and children, but we just live from day to day. Do you think there's some merit in that, where this trust of, okay, we just simply hand over a check to individuals, where does that leave us? They're not, the safety net is not going to occur in that kind of way. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I mean, clearly, I think there are some troubled families. But if you're living on the margin, your life is day to day. Now, whether your life is complicated by addiction, whether your life is complicated by domestic or familial violence, those are real questions and real challenges. But the fact that some people live day to day is a function of the fact that today they don't know what they're going to have tomorrow. And so I think we have to find a way to create stability and opportunity, as well as the service base and safety net, so families can grow and thrive. This country has systematically disinvested in families and communities of color in terms of housing, in terms of the quality of education in those communities. Education and work are the ways out. But when you have a dysfunctional education system, people don't see a future. And so we have to, I think we have to work to improve these structures and recognize there are some people who have very complicated problems, but I don't think that's everybody.
Okay, fair enough. So we need you talk about for example, the team that you're working with, and you know, how the passion is there. Take that same type of passion, and if you create this collaboration between state, community, and family, and have that kind of rigorous involvement at these, you know, at these level, what does that entails? And to better organize then, to promote the safety and well-being of children, especially those who are poor.
Well, first of all, I think it's got to be locality and neighborhood based. Okay. And I think, you know, the language around this is very complicated. I think that the state and the institutions have to make room for families to plan and have voice and be part of the solution. Far too often, the solutions imposed from outside without even collaborating with the people who need the solution, if you will. So, you know, I think it's got to be locally based. I think we have to create spaces where families' voices are not only heard, but responded to. I think we have to have accountability measures for everyone. So if you're doing a community development strategy, what are you really focused on? Are you focused on all the kids being school ready? Are you focused on increasing graduation? Are you focused on improving the opportunities in the workforce? There have to be some kind of metrics and accountability to it. But I think it's only when people can begin to have input into the process, influence the decision-making, and have it shape their reality that we get to a place where our communities are much more able to hold our families well and safely.
Sound good. So a more local, you know, community partnership, having the people who are said to be voiceless, that they become active in the decision making, and that sounds like a more you know, genuine approach to the solution or to problem solving. Excellent.
Yeah, it's more of a community development approach than a kind of bureaucratic institutional approach, but those two things should inform each other.
Yes, agree. So the experiences, and even with the current research project that you're involved in, um, do you believe that the system then, this bureaucratic process that you just mentioned, or this bureaucratic approach to things, is creating or causing the failure in creating the safety net for children and family, in improving the solutions, because sometimes there may be effective approaches or methods to the situation, but the implementation and those involved, it may not work out that way. Describe some of the multiple systems that may create this failure then.
Well, let me back up and say the system is a byproduct of our values and our commitments and all of that. So that if you're going to get systems to change, we've got to work on the values and attitudes of the people who can influence the policymakers, okay? Systems are designed not to change. I mean, that's the whole purpose of a bureaucracy, to make sure we do the same thing in the same way all the time, and it's supposed to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
But we do the same thing in the same way all the time, which based on history has not been fair, okay? So somewhere in this, I lost the question. But anyway, I do believe systems can change. I do believe they have to be pressured to change. I always think that if you're going to get something meaningful to happen, you have to have a combination of external pressure and internal willingness and openness to change.
But you actually did answer the question when you talk about the bureaucratic approaches and finding a consensus around particular values that want to promote the greater good for children and families, especially those who are at the bottom. So you did answer that question. So that helps me to kind of ask you this question then. You mentioned about values, because it does work both ways. There's bureaucratic values that is, I guess, in some ways, doing the same thing over and over is failing us, and it's based on these traditional ideologies. So, on a recent discussion about social service delivery and child welfare, there are suggestions that social workers should simply follow the government traditional model of social work, that is, that intervention, prevention, but this appears to be penalizing families. So, given that institutions and policies are very hard to change, which you just point out to us, what role then might social workers, child welfare workers play in influencing the fate of the child welfare reform in the US?
Sure.
Clearly, it's not going to be easy.
No, it's not going to be easy, but I mean, all of us have an ethical responsibility to make sure that the work we're doing is not damaging people. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's an ethical imperative for social workers, which means, you have to be both bureaucrat and advocate. And a lot of the changes and a lot of the ideas about change have come from people inside who've been dissatisfied. They've also come from people in communities who've been dissatisfied. But I mean, we have a responsibility to try to figure out better ways of doing this work, ways that really speak to the real needs of families and kids and provide real solutions for the problems they're encountering. What I think is a huge challenge is that we have multiple institutions that are not doing well at the same time. So we have problems in the child welfare system. We have problems in the juvenile justice system. It's very hard to get meaningful substance abuse treatment and mental health treatment. We'll fix the substance, but we don't care about your mental health problems that are causing the substance.
Right.
Okay, I mean, so we have multiple systems based on some of the same kind of principles and ideologies who've evolved in the same way. And so one of the big struggles now is to figure out how we can get a coordinated approach to change. There are reformers in the education system. One of the neatest things that's happened in education is some of these schools that are taking a family-focused approach. They're bringing the health clinic into the school. They're helping parents get their GED and advance their education. They're supporting parenting education. I mean, it's like the school is a hub of service for families, so you can get service without having to be labeled as someone who didn't treat their child well. So I think our challenge is not only to reform the systems that we live and work in, but also to make the connections to other systems and other reform strategies so that we really are looking at a network of change. You know, I often use the metaphor, you know, if you go into the hospital and you're failing, the doctor will say, oh, she's in multi-system failure. Well, I think for many of us, we're in multi-system failure, but it's not our bodies, it's these institutions.
Excellent point. So you mentioned, so let's explore some of the things that you just said. You mentioned that for, say, for example, social worker or child welfare, worker, to play out a large role in creating change, they have to be both a bureaucrat and
An advocate.
an advocate. What does that look like? Are you, let me have you clarify that.
What does it look like? I was a frontline practitioner in an adoption agency that had inherited a caseload of children who were older children, and this was before adoption was extending services to older children. Our children could not get into Head Start because they were wards of the state. Okay, this was a while back, but they were not eligible because the state was their custodian. So they, Head Start felt like they had what they needed. We sat around our little office and fussed and fumed, and because we couldn't get the kids into this. And then one day we just decided we were going to do an enrichment program for our kids to make sure they had an opportunity that was very similar to Head Start. And this tiny little band of renegade social workers who were employed by the county managed to beg, borrow, steal, and organize so that we could run a summer program for the kids and focus on not only recreation and enrichment, but making sure they were reading at grade level, all of that kind of stuff. That's an example. That's an example. I mean, you look at the circumstances you're in and say, how can we do this better? And how can we organize ourselves? I think one of the unfortunate things is that when we work in bureaucracies, it's easy to lose your critical lens because somebody said the rules are this, somebody says this must be done in this way. And in the back of your head, you may say, why? This doesn't make sense. And then you shut it down. Our job is to raise those questions out loud and see if we can make it make more sense.
Very, very interesting point. And so you mentioned the multiple system failure. You mentioned the mental health, criminal justice, and previously you also mentioned education as being a part of that failure. With all the things, I mean, I'm sure the ideas for that enrichment program comes from within your group, and creating this model. Do you believe, and I have a question here for you, what can the Association of Social Work Board, the Council of Social Work Education, the National Association of Social Workers, and any of those offshoot entities that are, called, whose mission is to educate and advocate and so on, what can they do to be more influential to the new set of students or the new set of social workers that are occupying these spaces, to not just simply follow the bureaucratic process, not just simply be the yes ma'am and follow the rules, but to be more of a social justice warrior advocate in changing? Because it sounds to me that we're just simply following the rules, as you said. And even though you mentioned some of you've seen some of the people like Black Lives Matters or people on your research team that are kind of taking bold steps, but that's just a small, what we call micro level faction there. We need bigger changes. So what do you think about all those entities can do to make this happen?
Yeah, one of the things that, particularly when I think about the professional social work organizations, the mainstream,
Yeah.
they have spent, and I don't criticize them for this, they have spent a good deal of their energy on making sure that social workers get professional recognition, in terms of a whole variety of things. And as a profession, we needed that. At the same time, we need more of what some of the minority ethnic social work organizations are doing, like Black Social Workers and La Raza, and the Association of Native American Social Workers. We need to reclaim, if you will, our social change agenda. I mean, I've taught social work students, you talk about organizational change, you talk about community change, but, I think that all of the professional organizations need to reclaim and strengthen the social change, racial equity, social justice agenda, so that it's not just on our statement of values, but that we help people understand how to operationalize it. What does it take to go from sitting at your desk, being PO'd because of the way clients are being treated, to changing that structure so that clients have a different kind of interaction? And I think learning to do that skillfully, learning how to challenge what is to move toward what ought to be, I think we have to elevate that in our discussions in the professional organizations.
Should there be more gatekeeping? And I've often asked this question at sometimes when I attend seminars or continuing education classes. And some people do not like that topic. Should there be more gatekeeping by these governing body about how to protect the discipline of social work? Where I remember saying somebody saying it's as if because you decide to become a social worker, and it doesn't mean that you have the greatest intention to help individuals and families, if anything, what some of these individuals may end up doing is to increase or carry out more of those bureaucratic functions and just simply step into that role to further cause more problems for families than actually being a change advocate for them. Should
Yeah,
there be
I don't
more?
know.
Should there be
Yeah,
more?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. And let me tell you why. Often gatekeeping keeps us out. It's a double-edged sword. So the question becomes, and I like to think about a lot of this stuff structurally. So the question becomes, how do we create structures in these bureaucracies that demand a certain kind of behavior that advances the agenda? Okay. When you talk about gatekeeping, it's about letting some people in and keeping some people out. And it just seems to me that in every place the profession is, there's some of that. But let's use it for good. Let's use it for a different result. My worry about gatekeeping, because I've been on a lot of admissions committees, I've been on a lot of employee panels. It's a real double-edged sword. So I think we need to think about gatekeeping, by whom, for what purpose.
Yes.
And you can end up on both sides of that question.
Yes, and fair enough. And that's why I said it tends to be a very hot topic, because it's, as you said, it's difficult to answer that question, because it can really, as you said, based on, you know, this concept of last in, first out type of, you know, approach.
Yeah, and it depends on what values drive it.
Yes. Very, very interesting. We get really sentimental when we talk about helping children and family. And I even kind of, you know, kind of emphasize the point when you talk about, you know, merit, and, you know, whether or not some family deserve the help that they should get from government, and all these, you know, concerns that some people may have in helping families. So should we, are there families that, and again, this question is going to come right back into, you know, who should get help from who should be in social work, who should not, who should get help from who shouldn't. But how far should our compassion be extended to? Because there are people in social work that does ask those questions, especially at some point in their career, when they're suffering from burnt out, they see little or no results. They see that they've used some of the most effective suggestions or solutions or methods to address a problem, but really with zero or little or no outcome. So how far should our compassion range be as social workers, or even as just human beings?
Well, I mean, I think we should always be compassionate. But when we're working with families whose behavior and choices affect children, you have to couple compassion with a certain kind of demand for behavior. It's not one or the other. I can compassionately ask you to begin some things or end some things, but I've got to be able, particularly in child protection, I've got to be able to establish, to supportively establish a set of expectations that you're working toward. And I have to be able to make a decision, an informed decision about whether change is possible or not possible. And I would say, in my experience, the vast majority of people are open to change if we treat them well and provide them with what they need.
Excellent response. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for that. I'm sure a lot of people would appreciate that response because sometimes you, as you said, somewhat you're working in a setting, and regardless of the amount of effort that you may, you use the word pee hole, where you have these feelings, but we should come back to the mission of social work, why we're doing it, and just continue with wanting to help families. You've shared a lot, and I really do appreciate your time. Any final thoughts about all the things that you said? Anything that what do you want anyone watching this interview to walk away with in terms of the themes from your response?
One thing that we didn't talk about that I would like people to keep centered in their work, in their practice work, in their policy work, is how critically important families are to children's development, and how absolutely devastating and long-term are the consequences of disrupting family relations, even ones that aren't perfect. And so I think as child welfare professionals, we have to understand that the kind of authority that we exercise has the potential to damage folks in ways that are quite profound. And that always has to be, it doesn't have to drive our action, but it has to be among our considerations, because for far too many of our young people, we've not been able to recreate family.
Excellent, excellent point. Thank you so much, Dr. Spigner, for your time, for your knowledge, and just for the work that you're doing. And I just hope that, through all these things, more students, more workers, everyone will be inspired by what you're doing. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for